Governing Council of the UN Technology Bank for the LDCs. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to today's UN Technology Bank webinar on STI and the LDCs, stock taking, challenges, and the way forward. Let me start with a very brief anecdote. Back in 2004 or 2005, as I was leaving the World Bank at the end of the day, a very thoughtful, very intelligent, and dedicated colleague asked me what I was working on. I replied, STI capacity building in Rwanda. Isn't that an oxymoron, he asked. He went on to argue that Rwanda needs to increase access to potable water, sanitation, off-grid electricity. It needs to improve public health and food security, increase agricultural productivity and jobs, and improve dismally low levels of literacy. What does STI have to do with any of these challenges, he wanted to know. And this was a rather common refrain and common question, unfortunately, back in 2004, 2005. But fortunately, many countries, including Rwanda, have made great progress in the ensuing years in building STI capacity precisely to meet these development challenges. And the global community clearly recognizes that STI capacity is an indispensable ingredient for progress in achieving the MDGs and the SDGs. You can't do it without science, technology, and innovation. And the UN Technology Bank, established several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago by the UN General Assembly, is the institutional testament to this recognition, because this is the job of the Technology Bank, along with other UN agencies, to help countries harness STI for development. So now our challenge is to, for the Technology Bank to work with, in collaboration with development partners and the LDCs, help these to devise the best strategies for focusing their limited R&D budgets on national development priorities, and equally important, to learn to use existing technologies developed elsewhere to address development challenges. After all, much of the world knows how to produce potable water and off-grid electricity. LDCs need to develop the STI capacity to find, adapt, adopt, deploy, and diffuse these technologies at scale. This is all part of what we mean when we talk about STI for development. So these are among the issues that we will discuss today, and I'm sure in the months ahead. And with that, it's my great pleasure to be the moderator of this panel. And I won't introduce the speakers all at once, but rather one by one, very briefly. You could read their biographies, which are available online, so I won't read their biographies, but just I'll introduce the speakers. The first speaker I'd like to call on for opening remarks is my good friend, Professor Zachary Hamid, Vice Chair of the UN Technology Bank Governing Council. Professor Zachary, the floor is yours. And is Zachary here? Well, perhaps then, Tess, we will turn to you, and as Zachary comes online, we will then switch to him, if that's okay with you. So I will introduce now Dr. Tafer Tesfashu, the Acting Managing Director of the UN Technology Bank, for introductory remarks. Tess.
Okay, thank you very much, Alfred. I'm sure Professor Zachary will join us. He said he will. No, first of all, let me thank all the panelists for accepting our invitation. Really very kind of you, short notice, but you accepted. This is very important report for us. And I would also like to welcome the participants who registered and joined us, more than 200 colleagues as of yesterday. So I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic and global crisis that followed has taught us many things. Now we can't actually discuss any of these issues without referring to COVID-19. But more importantly, it has taught us how far the world has come in technological and scientific development and knowledge accumulation, as demonstrated by the speed in which vaccines were developed and the role played by technologies in sustaining economic, social interactions during the lockdown across countries and regions. But at the same time, the COVID-19 shock also exposed dramatically the deep-seated technological divide and inequalities that still exist between high and low-income countries, particularly the least developed among them, as demonstrated, for example, by the wide disparity in access to even the simplest technologies and products such as PPEs, because countries do not have the capacity, the knowledge to produce them. And the speed of recovery has been slower in some countries than others, and technology has a lot to explain why recovery has been slow. Now, in this respect, the COVID-19 shock was really a real wake-up call for the LDCs, and an important lesson that they cannot afford to remain behind in their technological capabilities or miss the active engagement in new wave of rapid technological change. Now, when viewed from this perspective, the state of SDI and LDC report prepared by UN Technology Bank is timely and highly relevant for future development trajectory of LDCs. In a minute, my friend and colleague Federica Falomi will present the key messages and recommendations of the report. The report is comprehensive and provides an in-depth overview of the state of STI and LDCs, backed by numerous case studies. On my part, since I have only a few minutes, time is limited, I will just highlight 3 points that I believe are pertinent for LDCs to take into consideration as they move forward with post-COVID-19 recovery and growth and structural transformation agenda. The first is the need for LDCs to shift the STI policy emphasis and focus from transfer of technology to technological learning and upgrading and innovation. Technology transfer is important, but it's a beginning of a process rather than an end game, as is often viewed in some LDCs. What happens to technology or knowledge once it has transferred is more important than the process of transfer itself. The second point is that in most LDCs, innovation is viewed as an activity that takes place primarily in R&D centers only, or primarily in R&D centers. Thus, innovation policy tends in LDCs tends to focus primarily on how to increase public expenditure on R&D, and whenever they report about what they're doing about science technology, this is where the emphasis is given. You know, we're trying to increase public expenditure on R&D as a share of GDP. While investment in R&D activities is critical, no doubt about that, for boosting national innovation capacity, equally important is innovation activities and technological learning and upgrading that takes place at enterprise and production level. These are the type of activities, innovative activities that improve productivity and increase competitiveness and enable firms and countries to move up the value and technological ladder and foster structural transformation. So it's important not to neglect innovation at enterprise level in terms of incentives, in terms of policies. Finally, technological learning, adaptation, scaling up requires technical skills for which LDCs face 2 critical challenges. The first is the stock of human capital trained in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, which are really critical, is relatively low in LDCs due to low investment in human capital. The second, I think noticed often, is that those who are trained in these disciplines, a few of them, are unable to find gainful employment in the market due to skill mismatches and lack of appropriate employment opportunities. Now, while the first problem can be solved by enhancing STEM investment or investment in STEM type of training, the second problem can be resolved by having an institutional mechanism for linkage between learning institutions, private sector, which is really critical, and LDC should pay greater attention. Now, I don't want to take more time. Let me stop here, and I really want to thank you for joining us. Thank you, Alfred.
Well, thank you very much, Tess, for highlighting these critically important points, especially the importance of building up the STI workforce and skill base in the country, and then for getting that into the hands of the productive sectors and the service sectors, healthcare and things like that, so that they can use it to make a difference on the ground. Our next speaker is Ms. Federica Irene Filomi, who's an economic affairs officer at the UN Technology Bank. And she's going to give an overview, a report on the state of STI and LDCs. What are the key findings and key conclusions emerging from that report? Federica, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alfred, and good morning, good afternoon to all participants and to the panelists. Thanks again for joining us today. I'll try to give a brief overview of the findings of the report, which is a bit comprehensive. We tried to look at the 46 LDCs altogether at a time that we believe is very relevant for a number of reasons, and particularly because of the fact that we have seen it all with the last couple of years or so for the impact of the global pandemic, and the relevance and the role, the key role that knowledge and technology, particularly access to technology, played in terms of ensuring healthcare protection and access to healthcare, as well as the continuing of economic relationship and affairs and social interactions. Furthermore, we have entered the decade of action on the SDGs with their transformative promise of leaving no one behind, and making sort of the LDC the battleground on which this agenda will truly be achieved or not, as well as we've concluded the Istanbul Program of Action and approved last year the Doha Program of Action for the LDCs, which again identifies as a key focus areas the importance of science, technology, and innovation, and will shape actions at international level for the next 10 years. So we looked at the three core pillars of science, technology, and innovation, a number of indicators, survey responses, and interviews that we conducted with key focal points in the LDCs. And what came out in particularly in science is, as expected, that science systems show quite low aggregate government expenditure on R&D. We've heard it earlier. And particularly these values are far from the government's targets that have been set by themselves, as well as from, for example, the EU, the Africa Union recommendation of 1% of GDP target. More importantly, most of the government expenditure on R&D is applied for a more innovation-oriented expenditure, therefore making sort of the investment in pure science even more limited in most of the LDCs. Expectedly, however, the countries which have already started the graduation process and are closer to graduation have invested more in R&D, including in pure science. A key factor here is that there's still a large number of countries that do not report data on a number of indicators, and that constrains the capacity, we'll see it later as well in the presentation, constrains the capacity of making very well policy-informed decisions. Another key part, as we said, is the scientific capacity that's sort of very low and constrains LDC STI development to an extent. We looked at the investment in human capital, for example, as the number of PhD and R&D personnel in countries which display a large variation across the graduation classes. And we see some countries, such Senegal, as well as countries that have not yet met graduation criteria, not even once, that are investing relatively more in research. Therefore, that's a very good signal of the high importance attributed to it. In terms of scientific output, however, unexpectedly, performance is of course more correlated to the graduation level. In terms of particularly publication, interestingly, the LDCs have seen a very good growth in the last 20 years at a faster rate than OECD country, which is very promising. However, the number of publications per capita still remains much lower, with a better performance, of course, for countries which are closer to graduation compared to the average. Now, the divergence that we see in terms of countries that are investing heavily on science and research, and the performance, of course, can be explained by a longer output lag of scientific output, as well as partially by a productivity gap that's due to potentially governance and institutional quality, the limited international ties that can allow better and improved scientific collaboration for publication and so on, as well as the tradition of universities and center of excellences. Now, interestingly, however, scientists in LDCs show strong resilience and creativity, and with often limited resources, they're able to still produce valuable knowledge, particularly compared to non-LDC countries. However, some costs do remain a big challenge, such as publication fees, we know that, and open science in this case could be a promising way forward. In terms of technology, there's, we know, a clear gap in terms of particularly the capacity of LDCs to be equally prepared to seize the opportunities of digitalization and the fourth industrial revolution. There's a strong lack of appropriate infrastructure. We've looked at the access to electricity, as well as broadband internet connection and internet use, which are critical foundations to establish further technological development. And there's here a very strong split amongst countries that have, to an extent at least, enter the graduation process. Now, particularly, there's been a large effort to ensure population coverage by mobile networks. However, we know that the affordability and the actual internet use is still a very limiting factor, and particularly shows strong gender bias. Therefore, with the gender parity score being still under one, so displaying a limited access and use of internet by women, and particularly it's still worse than 2013. Finally, on the technology pillar, a key component we know it's skills and human capital that can allow for further technological development. And here we see a big gap from countries that have not yet entered the graduation process, which have 4 times less technical capacity available than countries scheduled for graduation, for instance. And that results, of course, also in terms of low technology output compared to the world average. It's almost half. Now, key drivers to catch up, of course, acquiring technologies. We've talked a little bit earlier in the introductory remarks about technology transfer and the needed capacity building process, and so on. In terms of innovation, finally coming to the last pillar, interestingly here, product and process improvements are perceived as important by entrepreneurs and firms in the LDCs as in the rest of the world, which is shown by the firms that are likely to invest in R&D in LDC, for example, almost equal to the world average. However, access to capital in the LDCs, as we know, is particularly constrained. And that limits, to an extent, the larger R&D investments and processes. Also, the high degree of uncertainties makes entrepreneurs slightly risk-averse in the LDCs. And there's a tendency, of course, we know it, for R&D to be rather informal in terms of time spent by by employees rather than the formal R&D, with innovation also being less novel. And indeed, the degree of formalization and novelty of innovation remains, in terms of patents, for example, remains very low compared to the rest of the world. However, we saw that LDCs are starting to, some LDCs particularly, are starting to explore and uptake this practice and patentable innovation. And here the gap has been widened in the last 10 years compared to LDCs, which are yet to begin this journey. Finally, on the policy landscape, interestingly, the majority of LDCs have shown mandated line ministry for STI. In general is the Ministry either of Higher Education, of ICT and Digital, or Research. But a significant number of LDCs is starting to set up dedicated ministry to STI or National Science and Technology Commissions. And most of the LDCs now are starting to have a national STI policy or plan either in place or under development. And interestingly, a third of these plans in general include sections on gender equality, while half of the HEMAP sections dedicated to environmental sustainability. So even these topics, which are of primary importance nowadays, are finding their ways within policy documents. A quick analysis on the impacts of COVID-19 on STI. Part of it is as it happened in the rest of the world. The pandemic sort of energized STI development because of sort of like faster and quicker innovation processes and digital transformation push. However, it also partially undermined previous gain made in STI development due to funding being diverted, productivity losses, and limited constraints on international scientific collaboration, as well as revised commitments by international partners. Now, interestingly, the LDCs have indicated that after COVID-19, they face increased challenges in the achievement of the national development agenda, competitiveness, entrepreneurship, and access to global market, jobs and growth, secondary education, and higher education. And that is reflected very well into the priorities they have identified for STI development in LDCs, exactly where a larger part of the LDCs indicated the relevance of STI development to achieve the National Development Agenda or the SDGs. And those came out as the first two priorities pretty much consistently across our respondents, followed by agriculture in terms of self-reliance and exporting, as well as competitiveness, entrepreneurship, and access to global markets, public health, jobs, and growth. Finally, looking at the most relevant future trends in STI development, digital transformation came out consistently as the most relevant trend, followed by increased economic competitiveness, enhanced productivity, of course, STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and closing the technology gap to catch up on other countries. Looking at the strengths and weaknesses that were indicated, it came out quite clear the key elements. Of course, there's a number of them that have been indicated as weaknesses, let's say, so indicating that a lot of action is needed and an urgent one as well. But the key 5 elements included innovation hubs and business incubators, as well as R&D in the private sector, particularly access to finance and strengthening academia and industry linkages. While on the other end, the legal framework for STI and the ease of doing business were considered a strength by the majority of respondents. Now, just to conclude, what we saw by analyzing the findings of the report is that definitely the LDCs display a very varied picture at various levels of STI systems development. There's promising innovation system with strong frameworks and clear political commitment in a number of countries, while there are also smaller and more disarticulated systems. There's, in some cases, a limited research infrastructure, while other countries show an active research community with leveraging the diaspora to contribute as well. There's countries in which establishing a business, it's easier with lots of support, hubs, incubators, and so on, while others have lengthier process, more complex regulatory structure, limited fiscal incentives, and so on. So the picture is really, really complex, but we try to draw some conclusions and identify some priorities for both the international community and national governments, and particularly this revolve around the importance and priority of financing STI systems building and development, both in terms of like infrastructure, but also capacities, as we said, strengthening digital infrastructure as a fundamental leverage to build further technological development, and supporting access to technologies and technology transfer, as well as strengthening innovation systems and particular linkages among the already existing very numerous actors in this area in the various countries, as well as supporting sustainable STI intervention through careful ex-ante assessment, both on the inclusion impact, let's say inclusion area, and also, of course, the environmental sustainability of intervention. Now, in terms of national governments, what came out clearly is that mainstreaming STI in national development agendas and strengthening STI governments is a factor of success, let's say a factor of future development, as well as removing disincentives to investing in STI, particularly for the private sector. And importantly, as we said before, develop and maintaining a complete STI information system and indicators that are fit to capture the reality of and the context of the LDCs to inform better decision making, both at the national and international level, as well as, of course, as we said, the foundation to foster widespread connectivity across the country and beyond the capital city. And with this, I'd like to conclude and give the floor back to Alfred. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Federica, for a very comprehensive, well done summary of a complex report. I would just add one thing to your very excellent summary of the report. LDCs have come a long way, but there is no finish line with STI. The challenges globally will always, new challenges will always be appearing. There are new scientific knowledge will appear as well. And it's the job for every country, not just LDCs, to build the capacity to continue the race, which goes on, and get closer and closer to solving more and more problems. So STI is a continual process of upgrading skills, capacity, and making progress, ideally. So thank you very much. Now we turn to a very distinguished panel of experts for a discussion. Oh, and I should mention that the report will be available online, and I encourage everybody to download the report, the executive summary, the technical tables, the statistical tables as well. And so you can view it and detail it as you wish. Now we have a distinguished panel of experts who will comment on the report and the remarks that have been made so far. I will call on them one by one. Again, I will not provide a detailed biography, but I would simply say that their biographies are very impressive. They are available online, and I encourage you to look through the biographies as well as listen and pay close attention to their reports. Is our first speaker, Professor Chen Keith Rethy, with us this morning? I don't think so, or I don't know, but while we work on that issue, I will take this opportunity to call on my good friend, Dr. Shamika Sirmani, who's the director of the Division on Technology and Logistics at UNCTAD, publisher of a large number of very important and highly regarded reports on STI capacity. So Shamika, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. And a very big thank you to Tess and the UN Tech Bank team for organizing this very important event. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, UNCTAD has a very long experience conducting science, technology, and innovation policy reviews. Both of you know, Al and Tess, about these reviews, and you have been also even engaged in some of the work that we have done. And there, in these STIP reviews, we assess the key strengths and weaknesses of national innovation systems and identify strategic priorities for actions. So based on this experience for over a couple of decades and many countries, let me share some lessons, 7 lessons that would be useful for LDCs. So the first lesson, it's extremely important to have a whole of a government approach to STI. Successful implementation of STI policies and initiatives depend very much on the political commitment at the highest level of government. And a whole of a government approach would be possible only then, if there's a coordination at a much higher level. More often than not, you all know STI ministers are at the bottom of the totem pole of governments. Unfortunately, they are not your finance ministries, the big transport industry ministries, but they are at the bottom of the totem pole of governments. They are junior ministries, unfortunately. They are new, underfunded, and understaffed. So the push for technological learning, innovation, and economic diversification should come from the highest levels of the government. And this is the experience of countries that have become that have been a lot more successful in leveraging technological innovations for development. And examples, I mean, we all know South Korea of the world, the Malaysia, and also more recently, Thailand, Cambodia, and Bangladesh. And we regularly urge countries to raise the status of STI policies in government, and most recently, the STIP review that we completed for Zambia. So that's my lesson 1. Lesson 2 is I'm borrowing from Tess. Don't confuse action plan with action. I think Tess, you used to say this constantly when you were working with us on a couple of STIP reviews. So establishing institutions and governance systems and defining goals, operational guidelines, they are all good, but they are only the first steps and should not be confused with implementation. In every LDC in which we have conducted STI policy reviews, we have noted that the drive to establish STI policies and plans was not matched with the funding required to build implementation capacity. And this is a direct consequence of the insufficient perception of the urgency of the effort that I mentioned in my first point of having a very high level commitment for these issues. So number 3, use STI policies as a tool for industrial and economic policies. STI policy cannot sit in isolation, in limbo, has to be very much connected to industrial and economic policies. And LDCs are the early stages of technological and industrial development. At this stage, STI policies and policy interventions should be demand-driven, focusing on providing the human capital and technological support required to build domestic technological and productive capacities. It's therefore extremely important to form strong linkages between STI and industrial policies and initiatives. But more often than not, again, STI ministries and industry ministries do not talk to each other. They are just doing their own thing without any connections. So this has been a problem, not just in LDCs, but in many countries, except your very few, South Korea of the world. Number 4, listen to practitioners and foster an effective government-business relationship. And this is also a very important point. There is a need for close working relationship between the government and the private sector. And I cannot overemphasize this point. This is particularly true in formulating and implementing policies that support the needs of the enterprises and while at the same time contributing to national development objectives. And it's the private sector that's going to be driving the technology and innovation, and they need to be listened to by the government officials who are making policies. The important lesson is that this relationship should not be based on formality, bureaucratic formalities, but on high quality information flowing back and forth between government and enterprises, and on mutual trust and confidence that expectations and commitments are credible from both sides. And this is another policy, another point that we make regularly, and both for LDCs and other developing countries, including in the STIP review for Zambia that I mentioned, and it was just published earlier this year. So that's just, clear in my memory. Number 5, rebalance the focus towards technology and innovation. I think we heard, Federica, from you, the science aspects of the governments and where they are going on R&D and the science fields. Here, I also want to emphasize, while science is fundamental and every country needs to have a solid scientific base, and our experience with STIP reviews suggests that rapid growth of technology and innovation can build from efforts in the technological base itself. So successful latecomers countries have built strong, productive, and manufacturing capacities by borrowing scientific advances from abroad and through imitation. And from then onward, they have been able to climb the ladder to generating more robust scientific capacities. And LDCs especially should rebalance their focus towards technology and innovation as pull factors to reinforce science and research capabilities. And this we identified very recently when we were working on the STIP review of Angola, the need to rebalance the emphasis on the science aspects compared to the efforts on business innovation. And this is also something that we emphasize in our STIP reviews in Uganda and Zambia. Now, a good example I want to highlight is the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation in Ethiopia. It was totally restructured as the Ministry of Innovation and Technology with a stronger focus on innovation, and the part related to science was moved to the Ministry of Higher Education. So the ministry used to be, when we went there, ministry used to be Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, and the science part was removed and accommodated with higher education, and the technology and innovation was kept as one ministry and given a lot more emphasis. And this gave a very strong indication to all stakeholders of the higher focus given by the government on technology and innovation. And I think the number 6, Tess, you mentioned this, move beyond technology transfer to innovation. Transfer of technology is essential. Nobody's questioning this. No country has accumulated knowledge and achieved economic development without acquiring technologies and know-how from the developed countries. And equally, no country succeeded in accumulating technological capabilities and fostering a robust national innovation system without concerted state-led efforts in technological learning and innovation. So it's not just what you get by transfer, but how do we then use this technology transfer to build the capabilities at home. So governments need to enable local enterprises to acquire technology from abroad through various channels of technology transfer, and at the same time ensure that the transfer technologies contributes to technological learning and innovation capability building. And there's a big gap here. It's not just LDCs, it's in many developing countries. Now, the last one is about learning to walk before running or leapfrogging, because with this new digital technologies, I think everybody's onto leapfrogging. We all think, okay, now we don't need to have any base, we leapfrog and we'll be somewhere else, but it doesn't work that way. Successful economies have kept up with new technologies while also mastering the technologies and innovations that are essential for improving productivity and competitiveness at their current level of development. So both needs to be given heed. In this regard, LDCs should go back to the basics of economic development. They need to focus on their development strategies and programs in diversifying their economies. And this is a mantra we say in UNCTAD, economic diversification, shifting output and employment of their economic activities from low value added sectors to improving and going up to higher value added ones, and increasing the share of manufacturing in total output. And in fact, in the very recent STIP review that we did for Angola, we noted that only a high dependency on oil, Angola of course has a high dependency on oil. So we introducing new technology in non-oil sectors that have very limited productive base would not improve the country's position. This was our advice. And it will require export diversification by strategically supporting priority sectors with higher potential for growth, structural change, productivity enhancement, and sustainable outcome. So this is something that we emphasize in Angola along these lines. So to conclude, as we have said in UNCTAD's Technology and Innovation Report 2021, please check it out on the web. Success in the 21st century will require a balanced approach between building a robust industrial base and promoting frontier technologies that can help deliver the 2030 agenda. And UNCTAD STIP reviews are a handy tool to assess the readiness of LDCs for technological change and innovation. And we stand ready to continue to support UN Tech Bank for LDCs in its mission towards fostering technology and innovation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Shamika, for a comprehensive set of critically important lessons of experience. I should just note personally, I've had the pleasure of both being a contributor to STIP reviews and an avid consumer of many more STIP reviews. And I recommend them very highly because if you read a large number of them, you really learn a lot about different lessons of experience, different ways that different countries approached similar problems, and you'll get lots of important ideas for yourself. And I think one of the things you mentioned towards the end of your presentation, moving up the value chain, the whole role of STI is to help countries go from producing lower, less complex products, which generate less per capita income, to more complex, more sophisticated products using science, technology, and innovation inputs along the way, and that is ultimately the route to wealth, irrespective of whether it's manufacturing, services, or raw materials that you're producing. Adding value generates income. Our next speaker is my colleague on the Governing Council, Dr. Betrina Diamet from Tanzania, and she is the director at the Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy Research Organization. Betrina, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, moderator. First of all, let me take this opportunity to very sincerely thank the Technology Bank, the organizers of this webinar, for giving an opportunity for me to share the little I have in the subject matter that we are discussing today. I was asked to talk a bit about measuring innovation. So that is my focus of my very short presentation, hopefully. And I will talk about, in regard to the measurement, about 4 things. Basically, briefly, the importance, I think it's important that we mention this practice of measuring and their development indicators in these countries. And I'll focus on Africa because this is the continent that I know, but also it's because most of the least developed countries are based in the African continent. And then I'll talk about major challenges that are sitting towards on the way to developing adequate and appropriate indicators for least developed countries, and then the way forward. Yeah, in terms of importance, measuring innovation, we have been talking about the critical importance of innovation in development, and actually it's very important. And we need to influence it. We need to build capacity, but you cannot influence something that you cannot measure. Measurement is as good as innovation is good for development, because if you cannot measure, you cannot influence it, you cannot plan for it. So this is in short, this is the importance, and it is used. The indicators for innovation are used in two major ways. First is benchmarking. Benchmarking in a long time in one country, you know, to see the progress you are making as a country. For instance, Tanzania, where were we 10 years ago to compared to today, and what are we planning for the future? So these are benchmarking, and it's very important that you note. But benchmarking also across comparing yourself with other nations within the same socioeconomic group like the LDCs. They should measure against each other, but it's also important to measure against the countries that are a bit higher in the level of development. So this benchmarking is very important, and basically it helps it gives impetus, incentive to actually promote innovation, to increase the effort towards innovative activities. The second utility value, which I think is even more important, is the use in policy. Indicators, every policy, evidence-based policies require indicators. So because policies are focused at addressing the problems, if you do not have indicators, you don't know how much you are doing, whether you are regressing or forging ahead. So you need indicators in the policy process, very important, because at the end of the day, the comparison is because you have influenced innovation through policy. And the second thing I want to talk about very briefly is the practice. Do we measure innovation in least developed countries? And again, I'll talk about Africa because this is the continent that I know. Yeah, actually, yes, innovation is a recent thing. I think the effort started by NEPAD in 2005 when they composed a group a working group to develop African innovation measurement manuals. In 2005, 12 people, I think I was one of them. But at the end of the day, finally, we did not develop the manual, and in 2007, it was decided that, okay, rather than developing manual afresh, we better use the existing manuals, and basically the OECD manuals. We use the Oslo manual for measuring innovation, and Faraskat manual for measuring R&D. In the process, it's more than 10 years now. In the process, it was actually confirmed, because this was also actually the observation that it won't be good, these manuals, because these contexts are different. Innovation is context-based, and the measures that are being used in rich countries, in developed countries, cannot be good for that can be used for poor countries. We had that from the beginning, but through practice, it became evident that no, there is a need, and we have been discussing over more than 10 years now, the need for coming up with appropriate indicators, manuals for Africa, in the rest of the least developed countries, but we are not there. We have been talking about, but of course, some steps have been taken by NEPAD, but we are still not there. We still don't have appropriate indicators or manual that fits for measuring innovation in least developed countries. And I am not so much worried about being able to come up with indicators. I mean, if we work, we can come up with indicators that are appropriate for Africa. But my major worry is the major challenge that I see is in the understanding of the concepts. You know, the concept of innovation lately is used so loosely. I mean, people use it differently. Sometimes people just use innovation and they don't even define, and even the related concepts that are related to innovation, like the STI, R&D, nowadays we have this concept that is becoming really very popular. It's almost replacing R&D, research and innovation. It is being used without understanding, without definition. And when you are talking about measurement, if you want to measure something, you have to touch it. You have to know it. If you don't know, how do you measure it? So for me, it's a major problem, because very few people are talking about this problem, that we need to actually have a correct understanding of innovation and how it can be influenced in the context of least developed countries. Very few people are talking about it. It worries me. It's not possible to develop indicators if we cannot sit down and really come up with what innovation means in poor countries. And the related concept, like the R&D, you know, that I was listening to the presentation and even reading the summary that the countries, the firms that are engaging in R&D in least countries is almost the same as those in rich countries. And it worries me because if you just look at the environment of these countries, you know, the human capacity, I mean, the level of demand for radically new products or process is low. There's something that is not quite right, you know. I don't know. So, but we have to really think about what does R&D mean in Africa. Is it, if it is the Frascati, that R&D defined as in the Frascati manual, it can't be. I mean, very few firms in least developed countries would be. At least this is also my experience in measuring innovation. Some of the very few studies that we did in Tanzania, people would say that yes, we are engaged in R&D, but if you look at closely, you find that it is not R&D as defined in the Frascati manual. You know, some of them could be just testing. Then can testing be? We can say that testing, let testing be R&D, part of R&D in Africa, but that is something that we have to decide. Concept of, you know, research and innovation, what does it really mean? It's not defined. Nobody's saying anything, but people use it a lot. If you read documents on rich countries, on developed countries, you realize that basically research and innovation is actually innovation that is coming from research, or research that influences, that is targeted at a certain innovative product. But the question is, you know, innovation is not only based, and I think this came up in the presentation, it's not only based on R&D or research. Innovation sometimes it happens because of just practice in the production processes. People innovate, and people actually also come up, people import, imitate adoption, you know, of product, of technology that has been used elsewhere. So this is not from R&D. So how, if you are talking about R&I, what do you really mean? What kind of innovation are you talking about? Especially in the context of least developed countries, where we know, and this has been spoken, and this is also what is indicated in the innovation surveys for the African innovation surveys. We have now, I think, 3 rounds of innovation surveys. Innovation is only through incremental innovation, is through imitation. That is a major. Based on R&D is very little. So when we are talking about R&I and how are we using it in Africa, and it's very important that we really know how we are using these things in Africa. And I can also, you know, even the presentation was talking about number of firms in least innovatives in least developed countries. It's almost the same. If you look at the percentages, it's almost the same as elsewhere in the world. And I was wondering, I think this is about the level of novelty, the degree of novelty of innovation. Because if somebody says that, yes, I have adopted a new product, but that product is just a transfer of an equipment from elsewhere, it's not the same as a firm that has done research, carried out R&D, and discovered something. Those are completely different things. And when we are talking about innovation capabilities, completely different. So when we are talking about number of innovation, and I think we have to really differentiate things. So basically, so what am I saying in conclusion? I don't have much time. I think when we are trying to measure innovation in Africa, or we are trying to develop indicators or towards our manuals, really we have to sit down and understand this concept, unpack this concept and say what they mean in the context of Africa. Innovation, STI, R&D, RNI, what do they mean? It's only when then we can proceed towards developing indicators. And for the time being, meanwhile, I think it is important if we measure the innovation efforts that are appropriate in the context of poor countries, in the context of least developed countries. Of course, R&D, investment in R&D is one of the innovation efforts, but the innovation effort in terms of technology transfer, I'm happy that this is what has been mentioned in the report. And we can talk about developing the absorptive capacity of our firms, of our innovators, looking at the linkages among innovation system actors. These are some of the efforts that we have to find measures, and then we can have innovation outputs. And but how do we know these efforts? What activities? I'm pointing to the importance of studies, innovation studies in the context of poor countries. It's only when you can know what kind of activities, because people are innovating. Sometimes we don't even know what is contributing towards that innovation, what factors we have to study, because even in Europe, the OECD manuals, if you look at the history, it started with small studies, what influences innovation in those contexts. So studies are very important, and actually comparing even with countries that are a bit higher in terms of socioeconomic development, we can borrow certain things there and we can develop the indicators. Lastly, about policies. This has been mentioned by Shamika from UNCTAD. Yes, policy is extremely, for me, it should be one of the indicators of innovation in least developed countries, because without policy, really innovation cannot happen because of the weakness in the system, weakness in the markets. Markets alone cannot do anything. I mean, there has to be government hands in terms of policies, evidence-based policies. And African, if you look at the African countries, many of the countries have got policies, but these policies are not implemented. At least I have evidence. They are just there, they're not implemented. If they're not implemented, they can really not help. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Petrina, for, as always, very insightful remarks. Again, my main takeaway is measurement is important, but you have to know what you're measuring, and you have to take a broad concept like research or innovation and define it in a local context that makes sense to the local situation, so that when you say the word innovation, it means very different things in one country than another country, depending on each country's unique set of circumstances. They are not the same. And also you mentioned towards the end of your remarks, the concept of absorptive capacity. And I can't stress in my own mind the importance of that concept, that it's not just generating knowledge, but generating the capacity of organizations, institutions, companies, entrepreneurs to use the knowledge to generate value for the economy, whether it's social value, health, food, products, value added. It's this absorptive capacity that becomes critical, the capacity to produce knowledge and then to use it. Separate things, but critically important and have to be related. So thank you very much. Moving on, our next speaker, Mr. Fernando Santiago Rodriguez, who is Industrial Policy Officer in the Capacity Development and Policy Advice Unit of UNIDO's Directorate of Technical Cooperation and Sustainable Industrial Development. I look forward to hearing Mr. Rodriguez's remarks and learning more about what UNIDO is doing in these critically important areas. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins, and thank you also for the organizers. Let me say maybe good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and of course, thank you, the organizer, the Technology Bank, for inviting UNIDO to join this panel. also, of course, thank you very much for the participants who are joining us today. Let me just, I mean, my question here was more sort of try to place the report in the context of the fourth industrial revolution and some of the ideas that are, you know, floating around. What does it mean for the developing, least developed countries? Let me just draw from some of the work that we have been doing at UNIDO around the Industrial Development Report, which is the main publication in terms of, you know, research activities at the organization. Particularly the 2020 and 22 editions address some issues around digitalization and resilience. But also some of the policy work that we do at the division here and some of the new tools that we're developing around these topics. And I think my comments will resonate very strongly with not only with the report itself, which I think it's a very nice effort to update on the sort of the challenges and opportunities that the LDCs face in the context of the science, technology, innovation, but also provides a very interesting recommendations. Some of them, I mean, urging the governments to strengthen some of the structures of the system, the STI system, the governance of the STI systems. But I think stressing also some of the comments initially by Mr. Tefaye in terms of supporting and continue to support the building of assorted capacities and investment in assorted capacity. So let me just try to make some reflections around these issues in the context of the fourth industrial revolution. And here, let me just place you in the idea of, you know, UNIDO is working. We understand digitalization and this sort of revolution takes place in very different levels. But, you know, for us, we are trying to focus really on industrial activities, basically also manufacturing. And so what you might be familiar in terms of the revolutions and, you know, what is really is a compilation of technologies that have been with us for some time. But, you know, these, you know, biotechnology, new materials, nanotechnology, advanced digital production technologies like 3D printing, CAD/CAM applications, Internet of Things. These are becoming really more pervasive, but also becoming more integrated, fused, and applied in different sectors, right? And we are, of course, familiar with applications in terms of health and you know, communications. But, you know, when it comes to the idea of applying to manufacturing or industrial activities, then we start getting to the ideas of advanced manufacturing or Industry 4.0, where, you know, these very automatized companies where sensors, robots interact with human beings in sort of very complicated ways of standards and, you know, what we call the sort of cyber you know, systems, right? So these kind of advances are now attracted a lot of attention. But really what we find is that the majority of countries are not necessarily, particularly the developing countries, are not necessarily at that level. So we have a mix of digitalization and advanced firms having some of those activities already embedded, but it's a lot of people have been saying here, context specific, requires understanding of the history, how much the industrial capacities and the industrial base of the countries are developed, but also some of the things that are also important in terms of the report, you know, infrastructure and you know, the sort of governance issue. So, you know, the issue here is how do we actually understand some of how can we explain some of the difference between the developing and the developed world in terms of developing some of these technologies and adopting some of these technologies that are now so pervasive in the mindset of people as drivers of the new industrial revolution and the future of progress. So if you look at, you know, some of the data that we found, you look at patents, for example, or presence in trade. So only 10 countries in the world, Germany, China, Korea, France, they represent more than 90% of the patents around these digital technologies, right? They're also able to mobilize and capture trade. I mean, more than 70% of exports of these technologies and how these are applied really for industrial applications are also concentrated in a handful of countries, these 10. So the rest of the countries, and particularly the LDCs, are really low engagement with this technology. So basically, this means that the technological frontier, the STI systems in the LDCs, are faced with a technological frontier that is not only moving fast, but is heavily concentrated. So those are the challenges that we start facing in terms of, you know, international collaboration, in terms of how to promote access to these technologies. But at the firm level, we also see some of those discrepancies in terms of, you know, developing a very advanced, modernized sectors, which are able already to embed some of these technologies. And we try to understand some different generations of technology, right? From very basic digitalization to some of these advanced applications. If we look at those things, I mean, of course, LDCs, the data for firms in LDCs is not really available, but we had some surveys run for the Industrial Development Report in 2020, where identified that even advanced developing countries like Brazil, Thailand. If you look at the sample of countries, only a minor share, say for Brazil, around 3 or 4% of companies were able to say report we have actively engaged with sort of these Industry 4.0 technologies. In some cases, like Ghana, 1%. But also what this means is that there's a huge discrepancy between some of those companies that are able to already work on these areas and the rest of the companies in the same country. So these islands of excellency, sharing or sort of coexisting with some of these, people say that's a sea of laggards, right? So really the idea here is that how to connect these sort of excellency, excellent firms with some of the rest. This is a challenge also, and then I think some of the comments already made make a lot of sense. So then he goes again the idea of building capacities because of this tendency of these technologies to fuse together, to work together, to sort of come together in terms of creating different ways of doing things, communicating machines and human beings. We can maybe just think about some of the challenges that the report has identified in terms of electrification, in terms of the governance, in terms of bridging some of the dynamics of the actors in the innovation systems within the LDCs. So, for example, here, if we try to sort of say there's a challenge for developing countries, LDCs, to sort of address some of the infrastructure gaps, particularly electricity, because electricity is very important to really absorb some of these technologies, right? Some of these technologies are really heavily demanding in terms of energy. And energy not only that is available, that is reliable, that is affordable, that these technologies require a lot of infrastructure, which is to energy and digitalization. So there you have a reason why countries need to be concerned about these gaps. Some of the productive capacity gaps we also, and also somebody was saying about learning. We have found that only when you have a sufficient enough industrialization base is that you can absorb, and people cannot use these technologies unless they are already familiar also with some of the manufacturing processes. So there's a requirement for pushing industrialization as a requirement for absorbing these technologies. And the STI efforts around improving some of the conditions to inform this. I mean, technological learning doesn't take in a vacuum. That you do need university research centers to really mobilize these activities, right? So we have some tools that have been developing in terms of helping some of these countries to create some of the basic diagnostics. Some people here have been talking about policy, but we also found policy requires capacities to engage in debates, to engage with evidence, to engage with decision making that involves other actors. So one of the dimensions that I think it's highlighted in terms of integrating some of the STI, embed STI as part of the development planning processes requires thinking on to what extent governments are ready to do this. And we have seen, particularly with this sort of interagency work, where UNTAD is also included, that some of the comments that we have from the policymakers, that we need to build the capacities of our policymakers to really engage with some of these new challenges. And we've seen, more than 500 people participating in events over the last 3-4 years that we have been running courses and activities. But just to close with some of the recommendations that I can draw from the work. So yes, we need greater international collaboration, and we need to focus very specific on the issues of technology, who is driving the technology, and how to facilitate access. Of course, there are difficult topics here in terms of the patenting activities and the IPRs, but this is a discussion that is interesting in the sense of enabling some of the LDCs to access the technologies that require for modernization. Mainstreaming STI as national planning, as I said, is important, but we need to think of strategic level, the sectors that has an intention in terms of the sectors, how to set priorities, who needs to be engaged in terms of multi-stakeholder processes. A lot of the technologies, a lot of the processes around the Industry 4.0 or for the Industrial Revolution are complex, but it's not just about technologies, it's about business models, it's about open access, open innovation mechanisms, really economic platforms, so really a lot of issues that are not necessarily only limited to technology, but also in ways we organize productive activities by using those technologies. So really it requires a lot of thinking. And again, yes, we agree on creation of productive capacities and productive capacities that are linked to technological awareness and readiness. So that means there's a strong need for industrial policies connected or better connected to STI policies and other kinds of policies in terms of competition and access to, for example, human resources and things like that. So which also creates a debate in terms of the balancing between the focus on science and focus on technology and innovation. But in countries where you have these resources, this is an interesting debate that needs to be addressed. And just again, the emphasis that is a very important dimension, or usually forgotten. And if we look at the cases of the Southeast Asian countries, this is balancing between ambition in terms of where the country wants to go and what it means in terms of the capacity to design policies, to mobilize the public infrastructure is very important. So with some of the reports that we have developed in the past, make an emphasis in terms of the role of governments in terms of driving innovation, right? In providing information. It's not just about funding, it's also providing access to information and knowledge for market. So there's a role that the LDCs would need to consider. And I think there is also scope for collaboration and exchanges in the context of forums like this, the Technology Bank, but also others that are offered through the interagency work that UN is doing. So UNIDO would be very happy to share, but I just to clarify, to remark the importance of thinking on industrial development as a precondition to address some of the challenges and opportunities that the 4th Industrial Revolution is bringing with the development that we see now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Fernando. Just to briefly summarize, I think you highlighted, again, two critically important issues, critically important not just for LDCs, I would say, but for countries at any level of development. One is technology learning. How do you build the institutions in a country that enables technological learning? It doesn't just occur, and the entrepreneur running a company may not have the capacity to be both running the company and keeping up with the latest 4th Industrial Revolution technology. So you need to build capacity for countries, institutional capacity for countries to engage in technological learning. And the second point, you made many important points, but the second one I will highlight is that technological learning is not something that policymakers, entrepreneurs need to deal with, but also policymakers. It's critically important to make sure that the policymakers understand the issues involved and how to approach the issues and how other countries have approached the issues so that they can make informed decisions about what needs to be done. So thank you again very much for your remarks and for summarizing some of the critically important work that UNIDO has been doing. I won't say over the years, but over the decades. It's very important. Our final speaker in terms of the comments from the panel is Mr. Rob Floyd, who's the Director for Innovation and Digital Policy at the African Center for Economic Transformation. And I would simply say that I followed the work of ASSET for many years. Many of my former colleagues at the World Bank have been involved in ASSET, so it's a great pleasure. We haven't met, but it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you and ASSET to the audience. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Al, and thanks to Tess and his team for the invitation. First, I should say congratulations to the UN Technology Bank for this report. I found it, I really enjoyed reading it and found it very informative. Sometimes a little concerning on the direction things are going, but very, very useful. I was asked to reflect on SDG 9C, which is to significantly increase access to ICT and STI. And so I have a few thoughts, but I first want to raise a bit of a concern. I was very happy that Federica highlighted the impact of COVID-19, but the world is also facing multiple crises now. Needless to say, the war in Ukraine is having a tremendous effect on many LDCs. There's a heightening debt crisis. Many countries are facing decreased fiscal space and liquidity. And what happens in these situations, it's kind of the opposite of sticky prices, where prices go up and it's very difficult for them to go down. Unfortunately, when budgets go down, it's very difficult for them to go up. And I believe, as Shamika had noted, many of the STI-related ministries and governments in the least developed countries, may be the first to see their budgets cut. And I think, we all have a role to play in advocacy on this. and to ensure that governments and the international community maintain a focus on STI and the investments needed. There's been a number of comments about whole of government approaches, and one of the things that we've started doing is every time we have a dialogue or a panel discussion on innovation or digital policies, we always ensure someone from the Ministry of Finance is in that discussion. One, it's a way to help them learn, but also to ensure that the STI agenda is on their radar, which I think it sometimes is not. So that's just one thing I would like to flag, and I believe many of us have a responsibility to follow this and do more research and analysis in it. I guess on ways to increase access, I mean, there's already been mentioned policy in here. I would say informed policy, and this is informed policy to allocate resources, to crowd in the private sector, to increase digital skills, to create incentives for the private sector. But it's not very easy, right? So we, as an international community, have been supporting governments to develop policy in health, agriculture, education, et cetera, for decades and decades. But many of the STI policies are related to things such as big data, artificial intelligence, blockchain, cloud computing, data privacy, data security. And these are things that every country in the world is struggling with, and including in Europe and particularly in the United States, I would say, in having a common framework and common approach to these things. And then added to that is the layer that, at least certainly for Africa, and I'm sure it applies to the other LDCs, these policies need to be contextualized to the individual countries and their scenarios and situations. I mean, we see, for example, if you look at AI policy and the biases that are embedded in many of the AI solutions coming from the West, they must be adapted to the needs of the LDC countries. Same applies, for example, to last mile connectivity or data ownership, which is extraordinarily low in the LDCs. From assets perspective, we're a big believer in peer-to-peer learning and bringing together policymakers and other stakeholders to learn from each other, both the challenges and the opportunities. And I'm very happy to say that we'll be using this report to pull out some of those cases and examples and use them in our peer-to-peer learning. Second, and it's also been mentioned, but is the dire need to develop ecosystems around STI. And it's easy to say that, and we all of us in this panel support the development of ecosystems, but it's not easy, right? One, there's many stakeholders, from the private sector to government to academia to research and development, innovation hubs, et cetera. So it's difficult to get them all together, and they are not actually always natural allies, right? I mean, we talk about the private sector and government collaborating and so forth, but often those relationships are not easy, to say the least. And so to get those actors in the same room, sharing, including their challenges, which sometimes exposes their weaknesses on both sides, is quite challenging. One point on the report is that the recommendation, or one of the primary recommendations around ecosystem development, was focused to donors. And here, I think that the governments and the business associations, the networks of innovation hubs within LDCs and within the regions have an equally important role to play here. It really needs to be driven by them. My third and last point is, Fernando just mentioned the need for infrastructure, and here Asset is advocating very strongly for the role of the private sector in digital infrastructure. According to a McKinsey report, 42% of all infrastructure is paid for out of national budgets. You take out some of the big power plants and ports and so forth, and my assumption is that the percentage of national budgets in digital infrastructure is much, much higher. And it's simply the only way that countries will be successful in ensuring connectivity to all, including last mile, and ensuring that it's affordable, is to crowd in the private sector. I mean, if we look just in sub-Saharan Africa, to bridge the connectivity gap will require 250,000 new 4G base stations, 250,000 kilometers of fiber, and we will still need satellites to reach 100 million individuals that live in very remote areas. And so if we cannot crowd in the private sector to help finance that, and certainly here in the international community, the World Bank, the EU, the OECD, all have, and the regional development banks all have an important role to play there in both policy support as well as guarantees and direct financing, but it really has to be private sector led. So I will leave it there. Greatly appreciate all of the comments from other panelists and look forward to discussing some of the Q&A that I see in the chat.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. Appreciate your remarks. So we have about 10 minutes or so, according to the official time schedule. And one question that's come to my attention through the Q&A in the chat, I will pose to the panel and just ask for some quick response. The question comes from Denaya Dennis, director of Conetta Hub, I believe in South Sudan. The question is as follows. How do we bridge the gap between government and enterprises in the LDCs? There has been no consistency with follow-up on policies. South Sudan has a very low growth in innovation and technology. What opportunities are there for countries like ours trying to recover from a long period of conflict? I should say that this, in addition to this work with the Technology Bank, I've been asked to get involved in some work with rebuilding Ukraine. And the same question, how do you use STI to recover from long periods of conflicts, is just as relevant for a country like Ukraine as it would be for South Sudan. So these questions, maybe the answer is slightly different in LDCs, but these questions are critically important. And would any of the panelists like to take a crack at responding to this question? If so, just unmute yourself and speak. Rob?
I can try to come in on this gap between government and enterprises. You know, when we sit down with the stakeholders in these kinds of agendas, the reality is that there needs to be incentives, right? Or each party needs to be able to understand what the benefit is to them. Everyone is, you know, I mean, particularly in South Sudan, government ministers are going to be extraordinarily busy. Enterprises are focused on making money, not talking to government. So we need to be able to identify what the benefits are. And I think if we can do that, be that through jobs on the government side, I mean, ultimately, certainly in Africa, the young population, governments want to see jobs. So if the private sector can provide those jobs, then that is a benefit. Likewise, if we can help broker better business environments, better investment environments for the private sector, then that's a benefit to them. But we need to be clear when we bring them together that it's not just a talk shop, and that we actually can identify those, and that takes political and a commitment from the government and commitment from the private sector on both sides.
Al, can I add a bit onto
Yes, please,
what Rob
Shanika.
said? Yeah, I think just to take from what Rob's point, you know, many times the private sector would think, oh, it's just a talk shop, so they don't need to go. I think this is true. This is what I all hear, not just on STI files, but we also do trade facilitation. work in my division, and that's also a file where you need the whole of a government approach, because trade facilitation is not just one ministry's business. So we always hear the private sector would say, it's just a talk shop, there's no point. But so we constantly blame the government, saying, the governments are not reaching out to private sector. But I think I need to make this point that the private sector also has a role, because it's also, yes, it may be a talk show, but it's in the private sector's interest to go and have this conversation, even to initiate conversations with governments. It's not like governments are not willing to listen in most cases. But I think this feeling, there's no point going to talk to governments, it's just a waste of time, is the attitude. But the private sector has a lot of power in many of these countries, many countries, because they are organized on the chambers of commerce, and they are the ones who are basically moving and shaking their countries, and they have a lot of say. So it's extremely important that the private sector represent themselves in this fora and begin conversations with governments and make sure that the governments would deliver. The policy is made to benefit the innovation. Otherwise, the policy would be made in a vacuum, and there will not be no connections between the industries and the STI policies. So I like to tell the private sector they also need to do something. You need two hands to clap here.
Thank you. Katrina?
Thank you very much. My point is the last speaker, I just wanted to emphasize that private sector and the government actually, when it comes to innovation, they meet through policies. As I earlier said that, especially for least developed countries, the firms, the private sector, they cannot do on their own because of competition. They cannot innovate on their own and succeed. They need government in terms of policies, the incentives, the instruments, and they have to be interacting to understand the instrument and be able to use them. So yeah, they very important, the government and the private sector to actually interact and speak when it comes to innovation, because they cannot do it alone. No, because the market alone cannot do in least developed countries. Policies is extremely important. It's more important than developed countries. In developed countries, sometimes, in some areas, just the private sector is alone can, through clear-cut market mechanism, they can link with the university, because in least developed country, for instance, we are struggling. How can we link the private sector and the universities? Because market alone cannot do that. The government has to be there. So it's very important, and they need to talk to each other from time to time. And the private sector should understand the role of policy, because sometimes, according to my experience, they really don't care. They feel that maybe policy is not important. As long as the environment for investment, tax issues and what, that is the things they care. They feel like they can just do on their own. So there has to be capacity building of the private sector, of the role of importance of policy in their work.
Thank you very much. Fernando, please.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's a very interesting, but also hard to answer question. But I think what I can offer is, I think there are two things that I can offer here. And one is the role of sort of mediators, right? So I'm sure, and I would say the academic colleagues here would be very important in terms of drawing attention on what is happening in some of these countries, what are the experiences where some of these linkages actually occur and how it's mediating. But I can also say that it's not necessarily in these sort of countries where there is conflict or the situation of fragile situations. Even in the experience we have in Latin America, seeing some of the how to set agendas. I think somebody mentioned about incentives, and incentives come also with common goals and sort of defining common targets. It's not a process that is easy to achieve, but I think it's also important to learn from other experiences. And I think the role of entities like us could be important in terms of sharing some of the knowledge where this kind of agenda setting, how to negotiate, how to establish commitments, how to establish incentives is very important for those countries who are interested in learning. And I think there's a lot of peer learning that can be fostered through to some of these mechanisms. So yeah, the role of the mediators and how that sort of who plays that role in the local context, and probably also learning on how these kind of agendas between the private and the policy sector can be negotiated in other countries that can be used as experience, can be a way to answer the question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And just sort of say and follow up to what you've just said, Fernando. I think the idea, learning from how other countries did it, how they built institutions to that brought together the public sector and the private sector for the goal of technological learning. That's a critical issue. Learn from these lessons of experience, learn how other countries have done that. And I just think that's an important agenda that we all need to focus our collective energies on. We seem to have be near the very end of our time. And so I would like to thank you all for your support and participation. But in closing, I'd like to call on Tess from the Technology Bank, the acting managing director, to make some final concluding remarks. So Tess, the floor is all yours. And after this, we will conclude.
Thank you very much, Alfred. You've done such a fantastic job. I think I won't do justice trying to sum up or pick key points, but one or two things I want to say. First of all, the report will be available in our website, and I hope people will use it as said, that is not only comprehensive, but it had a lot of data. It includes a lot of case studies, which makes it not only current and important, but also useful for both policymakers and researchers and other colleagues who wants to know more about the state of science, technology, innovation in LDCs. And secondly, we have established a blog recently to allow anyone who has something to say on STI, especially related issues in the context of LDCs, to share with everyone. So please take advantage, and 2-3 pages on any issue. I think that would be highly appreciated. Many issues were raised towards the end. We talked about the private sector. For me, the private sector in LDCs still underdeveloped, and in most cases informal, but it's the most innovative sector. It must be to survive under a very difficult policy environment, and in some cases thrive, making a living and contributing to growth despite so much obstacles, including corruption. That really, for me, makes them innovative. And what we've seen is that when the policy and regulatory environment is conducive, private sector responds. And we've seen in a number of African countries like Rwanda and Kenya, for example, how startups are emerging literally every day by so many hundreds by now, and 5,000 of startups, taking advantage of the little opening, a little advantage provided. So policy matters, I think. And government, public intervention, I see Rob's point, but public intervention is critical not to crowd out the private sector, but as a way of crowding in the private sector. Some of the heavy infrastructure investment, the ecosystem, unless you have public investment, is very difficult. Private sector in a country or a group of nations where income is low, the heavy investment required from private sector to come in. Of course, you can have blended investment, but that means the burden being taken by the government. So I think public investment in key infrastructure to allow the private sector to do what the private sector is good at, to be innovative, and then to acquire technology, and including new technologies and latest technologies to find solutions. I think this is very important. So I think it's important that policy is important, government, public investment is important. not public investment in sectors where the private sector should be to crowd out the private sector, as I said, but in infrastructure. Anyway, let me finish there and thank everyone, and particularly the panelists, for joining us and for sharing your perspective. We have our council members. We're privileged to have Alfred, of course, and Betrina. Unfortunately, Professor Zakari could not join us, but I'm glad you did. Thank you very much.
Well, on that note, I will adjourn the proceedings, and we look forward to continuing the discussions formally and informally in the days and weeks ahead. This is the first stage in a long series of discussions that will be going on, that have to go on. So thank you very much for all of your time, attention, and
Thank you,
participation.
everyone. Thank you, really. Thank you for participants as well, many of them. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shamika. Bye.
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 Bye, Rob.
Bye.
Betrina, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, keep in touch. Okay.